Okay, it looks like we have an excellent group in the room and it's 5 past the start, so we're going to get going. Hello, everyone. It is great to see so many familiar faces gathering again today. It's been a few months since this cohort gathered. For those of you whom I haven't yet met, my name is Emily, and I am one of the community managers at Founders Pledge. We have just passed 1 year since the launch of our climate fund, which is very exciting. And actually, as of today, we have published our latest report, a guide to the changing landscape of high impact climate philanthropy, which you can find on the front page of Vox today. So give that a look. Further, in case people don't already know it, today is Giving Tuesday, which feels really appropriate. We are so excited to be joined by a wide range of speakers representing organizations and projects that our team at Founders Pledge has identified as having the highest impact in the climate space, some of whom you may be familiar with and others who you will be hearing from for the first time today. We have 90 minutes together. Here is how we plan to spend it. In a few minutes, we'll begin with a presentation from Johannes, Founders Pledge's Climate Fund Manager, followed by 3 10-minute panel discussions from our expert speakers. We will then move into 3 breakout sessions for 30 minutes before coming back together just before the hour. A note that this main session here will be recorded for Founders Pledge members who aren't able to attend live, but when we move to breakout sessions, those will not be recorded. Please, if you can, keep your cameras on and ask any questions that you may have in the Zoom chat box. But as a reminder, you will have an opportunity to engage directly with our speakers during the breakout sessions after those panels. So feel free to hold your questions until then as well. Before we dive in, it's my pleasure to share just a high-level update on the impact of our climate fund so far. So we deployed $850,000 to the Clean Air Task Force and $400,000 to Carbon 180 directly after Biden's victory in the US presidential election to support engagement with the incoming administration and to push for innovation in neglected technologies. Our research team also broadened their scope to explore other theories of change, in particular around avoiding carbon lock-in in emerging economies. So this led to support of a globalization grant for Clean Air Task Force, which helps them become truly global. They have new presences in China, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East and North Africa, as well as a stronger presence in sub-Saharan Africa. Our team also continues to believe that Terra Praxis continues to do incredibly important work around shaping a conversation for advanced nuclear to address critical decarbonization challenges. So to support their scale and impact, we have invested in Terra Praxis's programmatic work, as well as supporting their overall organizational capacity. The climate policy debate remains less innovation-oriented in Europe as compared to some of the conversations in the US. This is why we are excited to scale a new organization, Future Clean Tech Architects, to help positively shape German, European, and global debates on innovation priorities. We are prepared to invest in supporting its organizational development, as well as key programs in hard to decarbonize sectors requiring more innovation, namely zero carbon fuels, industry, long duration storage, and carbon removal technologies. So this brief update is by no means comprehensive. It really just offers a glimpse into the amazing work that we have been able to support through the Climate Fund over the last year and change. We hope that it might also inspire future contributions to the Climate Fund so that we can continue to fund dynamic, innovative, and critical work in the climate space. I think with that, I'm going to hand over to Johannes and we can get started.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, and it's my great pleasure today to talk with you about the changing landscape of high impact philanthropy. And yeah, what I kind of want to start with is kind of how has the space changed since we last met actually some months ago. And it has changed really dramatically. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today, and also engage the speakers on how we react to the situation. So on the one hand, I think climate policy has really changed this year. We've seen this in the United States with the infrastructure package that has already been passed and the Build Back Better plan that is still in the process of being passed, but also internationally with India passing promising a 2070 goal for net zero. And also, of course, what's also really relevant for us, climate philanthropy has changed. So Jeff Bezos' pledges are coming into effect. And essentially this year, climate philanthropy by foundations will probably double. And this has, of course, real ramifications of what is kind of the most impactful thing to fund and what we should be doing. And that's really, what we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes and what this means for us. And here with me to do this are 6 amazing speakers. That were 6 amazing speakers and 6 amazing grantees. And we're gonna talk about first about advancing innovation with Michael Grapp, I believe, if he's been able to join us by now. He might be a bit late. Otherwise, we'll start with Peter Schneering, who's the founder of Future Cleantech Architects in Germany. Then we'll have a focus on emerging economies, kind of looking where 90% of future emissions are. We're going to have Kirsty Gogan and Loredano, and then we're going to talk about the Biden moment. And if this is kind of a Christmas party with your favorite climate people, this is kind of how I like to think about it, then this will kind of be the present section where we'll kind of talk about what the fund contributions so far have achieved with regards to the American landscape in particular. Okay, I hear Michael isn't there. Okay, so then we'll do this without Michael. But okay, just to start with, kind of improving innovation and neglected technologies. And I think if you've been to one of our events, you've heard those arguments before. So we're going to keep them a bit shorter today and kind of focus on the new stuff. But in principle, the reason we engage in innovation policy, innovation advocacy in high-income countries is really because this is the way to leverage the climate intention that we see in Europe, that we see in the United States, and in the UK, to leverage that attention for the maximal benefit of global decarbonization. If you've been to one of our events before, you've probably seen a graph like this one. So principally, we think about the theory of change here. We're going from advocacy. Advocacy leads to policy change, leads to innovation, leads to cost reduction, global scaling, and then gigaton impact. And that's kind of what we've seen with solar, with wind, with electric cars. The story has been repeated again and again and again. And it's like a proven story that works. And yeah, recently we had the pleasure to kind of get that story more out in the world. Michael Grapp, who isn't here, but where we made a grant to this project. So he and other leading academics published a study that was focused kind of on making this argument, what can we learn from those successes? And we kind of helped publicizing that study and kind of the question, what can we learn from those successes for those parts of the decarbonization puzzle that we haven't solved yet? And yeah, so this was like a very small grant, very time-sensitive grant. We literally made this decision in one phone call. We reached 4 million people that otherwise would not have been reached with this. So this was a really big success. Yes. Okay, since Michael Grapp isn't here, just gonna jump into what I think the key messages are from the report that are relevant for us here in the room. And I think the first message really is a message that this report drives home and that we've been kind of trying to talk about a lot in the past, is that government is really key in driving innovation. So innovation doesn't happen as a miracle. Innovation is a conscious choice. And that also means that policy advocacy, so the kind of work that we're funding, can be extremely cost effective in improving kind of the the decarbonization trajectory. And another really key lesson from those studies that are kind of assembled on this report is that the global long-run effects of domestic climate policy are easily 10 to 100 times larger than the domestic short-term effects. And this is really how we should evaluate those policies. Just to make this a bit more vivid, I'm from Germany. It's not a sunny country. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars on solar. It didn't really reduce emissions very much here at all, but it had like global ramifications that we're going to see over decades, saving gigatons of carbon. So if you look at this as a decarbonization policy focused on Germany, it's a massive failure. If you look at it as a policy to drive global decarbonization, it's a massive success. But ultimately, only global emissions matter, so we should focus on the latter part of the story. And then I think the third kind of key lesson here is that the advocacy that we're supporting here, so with Clean Air Task Force, with Carbon 180, with Future Clean Tech Architects, with Terra Praxis, and with other organizations, it's not focused on, I mean, it's in high income countries, but it's not focused on the emissions there. It's not focused on, it sometimes looks incremental. I think that's a typical objection, like a tax credit for carbon capture here, a tax credit for carbon removal, but ultimately it's not incremental at all. It's about transforming the global energy system and using the attention that is there for global decarbonization. Yeah, and to really kind of illustrate this, so to illustrate this a little bit, here is wanted to show like, why do we care so much about innovation? And that's really here illustrated here. We see a graph from the International Energy Agency, which shows the abatement potential from different technologies at different stages of technological readiness. And you can see that about a third or so of emissions are related to technologies that are right now have not been demonstrated at scale yet. So maybe they're in demonstration phase, maybe they're in prototyping phase. And just to give you a sense of scale, those are about 360 gigatons of emissions, which is more than 7 years of global emissions. So this is like a lot of emissions. And if you kind of say, okay, already 2/3 of this are going to happen, of this innovation are just going to happen, I don't believe that, but just to kind of make it conservative. If you believe that were to be true, and they say it's only like 1/3 or so of those emissions that you can affect, and then you would further think something like, okay, maybe how much we can affect this is roughly proportional to how much innovation capacity different regions of the world have. For Europe, this would be something like 20% or so of global innovation. And if you kind of do all of the math, then you would kind of come out at something like this here for the impact of European innovation policy on global emissions. And crucially, that even if you take all of these like very conservative assumptions, this is far more than kind of European emissions. So this is like, this is at least 5 or 6 years of European emissions in total that you can kind of affect through European innovation policy. And of course, this shows that improving these kind of policies is actually really key, and it's a really high impact lever, probably much higher so than like focusing on the domestic effects. And yeah, so this is kind of this is the example for Europe. And as Emily kind of mentioned at the top, Europe, while there's a lot of climate attention, this attention is much less innovation focused, I'd say, than what I'm used to from the United States. And kind of someone who's helping, I think, to change this, and that's why we're so excited about Future Clean Tech Architects is Peter Schneering, and I kind of want to talk with him next. Hi, Peter. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Johannes. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the first question that I have for you, if we're kind of saying, okay, European innovation policy really has such a big effect, possibly such a big effect on kind of future emissions. How could this actually be improved? Like, what is currently going wrong in European innovation policy that is kind of limiting the potential, limiting the actual consequences rather than kind of the modeled or potential consequences?
Thank you. Well, I think there's various reasons for that. First of all, meanwhile, there's a lot of good intentions out here in Europe to improve things and to really get going on climate technologies. But it is a very slow system. Many nations, and I'm sure many observers or many of the audience know European countries and know how bureaucracy works, and that while there's an excellent R&D landscape as such, there's not such an excellent way of scaling these technologies. And a second point is, of course, that the priorities in national R&D strategies, in innovation strategies, are still biased towards the more mature technologies and not at all focused on the hard to decarbonize sectors, those sectors we really want to tackle. So I think it's changing the innovation system of nations, especially European nations, is a little bit like navigating an aircraft carrier. It's a slow business. It takes several years to turn it around, and it takes a lot of advocacy, as you've pointed out in the on one of your previous slides.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I think that's kind of leads me directly to my second question for you. So as Emily mentioned, so we're making a big investment into future clean tech architects for you to kind of scale from a 3-person organization to a much larger organization and focused on key sectors. What do you kind of hope to achieve, or what is kind of the levers that you're trying to push with this?
Well, we have like 3 main segments that we've been focusing on during the past 2 years, and that we would really want to get going in 2022. One is the sectors I've already mentioned. So we need more attention to those sectors that are hard to abate, that are hard to decarbonize. They do not receive enough attention anywhere you go in the innovation stages, basically. And a lot of them, as you've pointed out, the IEA figures reach up to 50%, are still in very early stages, are not developed yet. Those technologies we need to reach net zero eventually. A second part we're stressing with our work is favoring high impact innovation or breakthrough innovation over incremental approaches, because also, as many of you know, the mature technologies receive a lot of funding. They still receive funding in the R&D phase, public funding to incrementally make, for example, certain PV technologies better, enhance what you harvest out of on or offshore wind turbines or something like this. And this is even more true for the following stages then. Of course, when we talk about TRL 5 or 6 or 7, it's easier to get venture capital for more mature systems, or for systems that have been proven in some way and where updates are coming out and being presented to the market. And so we're trying to combine advocacy for these hard to abate sectors. We're trying to combine innovation, a very sustainable and very comprehensive innovation policy advocacy with key stakeholders in the German scene and in Central European countries, with something we call boots on the ground in developing these technologies. So we've actually won 3 grants, or we're part of 3 research consortia where we are developing technologies on low carbon cement with large research institutes in Europe or Germany, on decarbonizing industry, especially metalworking, emissions intensive industries. And we're pitching for a 4th one right now, which will be focused completely on aviation, zero carbon fuels. So fuels for aviation, also the shipping sector. So these are things we'd like to combine, and we're still a small organization, but we'd like to get the maximum leverage out of this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. And just, I guess, for those a bit less familiar, just to contextualize that, I mean, those hard to decarbonize sectors, I mean, as the name suggests, those are the ones that are kind of creating most of the problems and like an increasing share of future emissions, because on current trajectory, they will not decarbonize. So that's why it's so important to focus on them rather than on the more mature technologies. Okay, Michael Grapp has joined us now. So I kind of want to throw 1 or 2 questions to Michael. And I think the first one I kind of want to ask is, Professor Grapp, what can we actually learn from your report about kind of how to make innovation happen for those parts of the decarbonization challenge where it hasn't happened yet?
Sorry, you can hear me now? Great. So there's quite a lot to learn. Let me just say by way of background, of course, there's an enormous range of technologies at different stages of development. It's quite sobering to think that only 10 years ago, quite a lot of people might have described electricity as a hard to abate sector, certainly in terms of what a lot of economists said about the cost of solar. So what we did in this work was to look at 3 historical case studies and then try and draw out more general lessons. So we looked at solar, wind, and light emitting diodes, and we worked with the major emerging economies. In fact, worked out quite well, worked with Brazil, who's really jumped ahead of other major economies on wind energy, with China on solar and Brazil on efficient lighting. And there's a lot of issues and insights that come out of those case studies. If I just run them quickly, first, all 3 of those transitions have succeeded wildly beyond expectations. Nobody really predicted the extent of cost reductions that we saw in what had been considered, particularly for PV, very expensive, and for LEDs was really only just coming out of the labs a decade ago. A second point is the traditional approaches to economic appraisal, and here this report was really oriented towards governmental decision makers and treasuries who are often skeptical about things. So the second was traditional approaches to economic appraisal. It's not just that this stuff is uncertain, but they tend to bias decision makers towards modest or incremental changes. And really the classical economic toolbox of, what are the costs, what are the benefits expected, are just not appropriate for major technological transitions. There are, if you like, better toolbox of theories around new approaches, evolutionary economics, systems complexity, which describes how innovations emerge, grow, prosper, build up industrial supply chains, cost decline, becomes a positive reinforcing cycle. But to get at those, you can't pretend you know all the costs and benefits at the outset. You really need to adopt approach evaluating risks and opportunities. It's not all saying this is easy, but clearly there were huge opportunities that we only realized by really going for it, by building upon the R&D base of, for example, solar that had been going for a few decades, and really starting to put in place the policies to build up scale and learning. The final insight we got from this, and we did look at some future case studies around electric vehicles and steel in particular, is all of the historical ones had elements of international complementarity, and the future cases could benefit hugely from government-led international collaboration in innovation, in scale, in finance, and in setting standards. So, it was actually a pretty positive message that came out of this study. We have broken through in some areas. Other areas look really hard to treat, and unless we try seriously, they probably will continue to look hard to treat. But there are a lot of ideas around. We really need government policy to get more effective and committed about pulling those ideas through into the kind of market and cost reduction dynamics that we've sketched in this report.
Yes. So, yeah, thanks so much, Professor Grubb. Yes, that covers it. And yeah, you'll have more chance, everyone, to ask Professor Grubb and all the other speakers questions in the breakout, because now we kind of have to move to the next section. And yeah, we're kind of going to leave Europe behind now. We're going to focus on emerging economies. Okay. And yeah, emerging economies, of course, or those economies outside the EU and outside the US. This is where 90% of future emissions are. So, of course, we can focus policy in the UK, in the US, and Europe on innovation for global decarbonization, but there's of course also a case to engage directly in regions where emissions are going to increase the most. But I think the first kind of challenge in the section that I want to talk about is this challenge of committed emissions. And this is from a paper from 2019. And what this shows is committed emissions. And committed emissions are those emissions where if coal plants, steel plants, etc., if they kind of run their natural lifetimes, those emissions that they will kind of committing into the future. And what you can see here is again, this is a really big emission stream. So these are gigatons. This is more than 400 gigatons. So this is more than 8 years of emissions at current levels. It's also more that alone will kind of, if all of those emissions are emitted, this will already kind of break the Paris targets. So these are really large numbers. This is really a big problem. And one problem really that kind of is particularly dominant is really new coal facilities, new coal assets, very new coal assets in Asia, particularly in China, but also in India, also in Indonesia, etc. You can see this here. So there's a lot of really new coal capacity in emerging economies, and that's obviously really, really big problem for climate policy. And what are we going to do about this? And there are people that are very optimistic that we're just going to prematurely retire all of those coal plants. But I guess that's not something I would bet on. And I think it's really important to have alternative plans for how we're actually going to decarbonize this. And this is something I want to talk about with my next speaker, Kirsty Gogan, who's the managing director of Terra Praxis. She's been here before. And yeah, the great thing about Kirsty is that she's talking about not what climate can do for nuclear, but what nuclear can do for climate, for solving the very hardest decarbonization problems and hard to decarbonize sectors, what she talked about last year on nuclear hydrogen, but also for the challenge of committed emissions and coal in particular. Hi, Kirsty.
Hi, Johannes. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So yeah, what can we actually do if we don't believe that all of those coal plants will just be retired 10 years into their lifetime that would otherwise be like 40 years? What's kind of the solution set looking like? What are you working on?
Thank you. Yeah, it's really, I think it's unforgivably unrealistic for us to assume that we're just going to abandon all of those assets, particularly, as you say, in parts of the world where they're very young assets as well. You know, on average, around half of the global fleet is only about 14 years old. And there's there's $1 trillion of unrecovered capital locked in that global coal fleet. About 2 terawatts is still expected to be operating by 2050, which just on its own would swallow up all of our remaining carbon budget. So huge issue. And so, but it's much more than just locked in emissions. These plants are kind of locked into our sort of socioeconomic structures. That's why it's so difficult to consider the prospect of closing them prematurely. You know, they're integral to economies. They're the basis of electricity generation infrastructure in countries that need that reliable electricity generation, apart from anything, to create resilience against climate impacts that they're already experiencing. There's the locked in unrecovered capital. And even in countries with old coal, like in the United States and Canada and Europe, we know how difficult it is to try to close down those coal plants. Just look at the sort of Manchin political deadlock in the US at the moment that's, you know, threatening to kind of like hold the Biden climate plan to ransom. So yeah, we see this as a, you know, a very intractable problem that's really about sort of the kind of the deadlock around, you know, the devastating impact that closing these plants will have on communities, the loss of jobs, revenues, and all of the other socioeconomic benefits associated with them. So we try to see this in the larger context. So and design a solution that addresses all of these challenges rather than just sort of throwing it into a kind of simple, you know, these plants create emissions, therefore we have to close down the plants. How could we potentially keep all of the additional benefits, all of the jobs and the socioeconomic benefits and so on by repowering these plants with new heat sources, and that eliminates the emissions. So essentially what we're proposing to do is replace the coal boiler with an advanced heat source that enables the reuse of the existing infrastructure, keeps the jobs, keeps the transmission, which is another huge risk to our transition generally, the need to build out massive amounts of new transmission, which is extremely tough. You think it's difficult building new generating technologies, it's really hard building transmission. And the other big challenge, of course, is that we have to do that really, really fast. So we have, you know, as we all know, we have 28 years now till 2050. We have to decarbonize our entire global fossil fuel infrastructure, probably double or triple it to meet rising global energy demand. So the more that we can reuse existing infrastructure where you already have these ecosystems of skills and capability operating around these plants and all of the infrastructure associated with them, we think that this is a way of de-risking the clean energy transition. And it's also a way of unlocking the resistance that we're encountering, that we're likely to encounter if we try to just shut down those plants.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kirsty. And again, everyone have a chance to ask Kirsty a lot more questions later. But I think one thing I want to talk about now is, so I think until last year, I don't think I ever heard about this idea, repowering coal with nuclear. And I've been in climate pretty much for the last 10 years. And so why is it that kind of no one talks about this? And I think one of the reasons is, of course, is that the climate conversation overall is heavily anti-nuclear, and I mean this is also certainly true for climate philanthropy, where it's like, I guess it's like climate philanthropy that is pro-nuclear is maybe like 5% or so of total climate philanthropy if it's large. I think that is our most conservative estimate. So this is the estimate where we have assume the largest share of climate philanthropy that's focused on nuclear.
I think the climate philanthropy focused on nuclear is all funding anti-nuclear people.
Yeah. So this is, yeah. So in any case, so I think the important lesson here is, I think the important lesson for us as kind of as philanthropists is that, you know, like you can be really, like, even if you're quite pessimistic about advanced nuclear, even if you're like 10 times more pessimistic than Kirsty is, like this is still a bet we should be making, because it solves like a really important problem, and it's the kind of bold action that we should take more of. And that's kind of, I think, something that we're trying to do with the fund all the time. It's why we continue to support TerraPraxis, and why we think it's really important to kind of correct those blind spots and kind of put the additional money in not where everyone else is putting the money, but kind of put it into other sectors and other solutions. Yeah. Okay. But now I kind of want to change this a little bit and go kind of from this issue of how do we kind of avoid carbon lock, how do we reduce carbon lockdown? So how do we turn those committed emissions into, well, zero carbon streams into actually like avoiding carbon lock-in in the first place? And yeah, we're also going to change geographies a little bit. So now we're going to talk about sub-Saharan Africa in particular, where I think it's pretty clear that on current population trends and also economic trends, emissions will go up for the foreseeable future. You can also see this here. So this is a study from earlier in the year, which kind of studied based on current trajectories of what is kind of in the pipeline in terms of new power infrastructure, that about like on this, the best guess scenario of the study, kind of what they estimated to be the most realistic scenario, is that in 2030, you would have about 70% or so fossil infrastructure in Africa and electricity generation. This wouldn't be coal, this would mostly be gas, so it's kind of better than emission trajectories in China and India, but it's still like a huge kind of lock-in of new fossil infrastructure that won't matter for emissions so much, for global emissions over the next 2 or 5 or maybe even 10 years, but it kind of matters for the 2050 outlook quite tremendously. So this kind of raises this question: how can we actually avoid carbon lock-in at the first place, and also at the same time kind of avoiding, at the same time doing this in a way that's kind of really recognizing the fact that these are regions in the world that actually need a lot more energy rather than less. And yeah, here with me to kind of discuss this topic is Lily Ardano from the Clean Air Task Force. Hi, Lily.
Hi, Johannes.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Yeah, and I kind of wanted to hear from you. How do you think about this challenge? How do you think about how do we avoid kind of carbon lock-in, and how do we combine this with kind of a prosperous vision for the future?
Yeah, thanks again, Johannes, and good to be here, everyone. So I think I'll start us off by setting some context as to, why we have this two-part problem when we talk of sub-Saharan Africa. So I think Johannes did a great job showing us what potential future emissions could look like on the continent, and why it's important that Africa is a consequential actor as we think of future emissions and how to keep those down. But I also wanted to mention that the region as a whole currently has the lowest level of energy use per capita. And this is because of low economic growth and energy poverty, which is the lack of access to affordable and reliable power for those who need it. So if you exclude Sub-Saharan as South Africa, what we realize is that in Sub-Saharan Africa, the average person is consuming about 500 kilowatts per year, and compare this to about 13,000 kilowatt hours consumed by an American in a year, and about 6,500 consumed in the European Union. So there's a huge disparity in terms of consumption, and African countries are looking to grow energy consumption, even as the continent looks to industrialize, even as population increases. So how do we reconcile the two? It's a very very tough question. I like to think about this by thinking about what those future development pathways for the continent could look like. And I think of it in three ways. That, the first scenario could be one where we have continued low consumption on the continent. And what this means is that we will see a dramatic increase in the number of poor people in the world if we have that constrained consumption, and so many people by 2050, a quarter of the world's population will be Africans. So keeping that low consumption and having population grow, you're going to have so many people in the world who are going to be poor. The second scenario could be that per capita consumption grows, but that this is still going to be fed largely by fossil fuel sources. So currently Africa is still, even though hydro has played an important role, we are still quite heavy on fossil fuels, natural gas, predominantly, but also coal to an extent because of South Africa. That could change significantly as we go forward, and oil. And the third scenario is one where we see a substantial increase in per capita energy consumption, but where this could be combined with an uptake of zero carbon technology options. That third scenario will not happen automatically, obviously, and it's going to require very intentional efforts for us to set the continent on a low carbon development trajectory. So at Clean Air Task Force, the way we are thinking about it is through a two-pronged approach. So the first one for us is, how do we set the stage for low carbon development on the continent, avoiding lock-in? We are cognizant of the fact that for some of these technologies, they may not yet be there for the African continent, but we also feel that it's problematic to leave the continent out of these discussions without preempting and planning for the growth in consumption as we go forward. And as we think about the growth in demand, this could represent a potential market for zero carbon sources as we go forward. So how do we utilize the region's rich energy resource endowment, human capital, young population? How do we utilize those resources to think about a clean energy future for the continent? And one of the things that we think that needs to shift radically is the idea that the region or the continent is a consumer of technologies rather than an active participant in advancing the global energy transition. And so our strategy in the region is to look at how we establish research and innovation hubs on the continent, working with existing research centers and new ones to think about how we enhance zero carbon research, technology research and innovation on the continent, and how we think about supporting collaborative markets and commercialization studies, which look into some of these zero carbon technologies on the continent. And so in Kenya, for instance, we are just beginning a research effort looking at super hot rock geothermal. Is there potential in Kenya? They are successfully using conventional geothermal technology. Could SHL perhaps help to scale that beyond Kenya as well? What does that look like? So we are looking into some of those questions. And then secondly, we also recognize that the successful development of the African continent, as well as decarbonization, will require more than technological fixes. And the challenge on the continent is beyond technology alone. We are talking about issues with the functioning of utilities and power markets. And so having those well-functioning utilities and well-functioning regionally integrated markets, which are so key to clean energy markets, is an important area of focus. It needs attention if the continent is going to avoid carbon lock-in. Thinking about how we boost demand by stimulating productive use of energy on the continent is a core part of any strategy that helps to put the continent on a path towards a clean energy future that avoids carbon lock-in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lily. And yeah, I'm gonna go over this slide very quickly because we're a little bit short on time. But I think one thing that I kind of want to mention to kind of contextualize what Lily just said in the context of philanthropy and also like our kind of grant to help CATF scale globally. So if you kind of look at this as climate philanthropy by sector and region, and what you can see here is that there's a really big area of combination of regions and sectors where there's almost no attention at all. So it's true that there's like a lot more attention now on kind of climate philanthropy targeted at non-OECD countries. If it's focused on clean electricity, if it's in there, I mean, essentially only solar and wind, then there's some attention there. Then there's a lot of attention on natural solutions, so on forestry and other kind of natural solutions. But there's almost no attention to kind of industry, transport, other kind of sectors of the economy. And also like within electricity, I guess the focus is very focused on a small set of technology. So this is kind of what motivates our grant for this global expansion, because these are, of course, also CATF priorities. But now I kind of want to go back and kind of go to the, finally go to the American situation and the question of like capitalizing on the Biden moment. And then in this case, particularly talk about the grants, the first kind of grants where we can kind of report first results from the Climate Fund. And and we're now going to switch gears once more in terms of the topic. So we talked about energy innovation and we talked about avoiding carbon lock-in. And like, let's say we succeed at both of those things. Even if we succeed at both of those things, we still need to like suck gigatons of carbon out of the year. Out of the air every year. I'm sorry. And so this is a daunting challenge. And so this is a challenge that aptly named Carbon 180 kind of works on tirelessly every day. And here with me to discuss this is Aaron Burns, Executive Director of Carbon 180. And Aaron, nice to see you again. And could you tell us what should make us hopeful that we can actually solve this daunting challenge of getting gigatons of carbon out of the air every year? What's kind of in recent policy wins in the US that kind of will help with this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think carbon removal is a really helpful example on why you need policy to scale certain climate pathways, right? It costs money and you're going to need federal policy support to get it done. And the thing that makes me hopeful, or the thing that we're really excited about right now, is all of the major wins for climate in the infrastructure package that was just passed in the US. And I think it's easy to forget that even just a few years ago, climate wasn't a center stage issue in the US. It was seen as pretty niche. It wasn't a part of these really big legislative packages. And I think the infrastructure bill is about as big of a signal that you can get that things have really, really changed. And, the discussion today is typically more on, is that enough? Like, are we doing enough? What more do we need? And, the infrastructure bill isn't enough, but it is such a big step. And I think for many of us, Lindsay will, I'm sure, talk about this as well. But for many of us who've been spending the past decade or so working on climate policy and getting people to just even talk about climate policy was a big deal. To see these major wins was really exciting. And I will say, I think not just to see them in there, but I think, look, everybody knows that in the US, climate is a partisan issue, but many of the provisions, and especially I'll say many of them that I will touch on briefly on carbon removal that were in the infrastructure package were bipartisan. A few of them were pushed by Republican members, and like really big investments in climate technologies and pathways from Republican members. And so even if climate as a whole is a partisan issue, there are these places where we can get a lot of bipartisan, nonpartisan support for really serious action, not this little, not little incremental changes. And so I'll say, of course, we are most excited about the carbon removal provisions. And in particular, there are a few big things. There's $3.5 billion, billion with a B, for 4 regional direct air capture hubs. There is billions for forestry. And then there's millions for carbon storage permitting, among several other provisions. And I'll say, it's not just the sheer size, that billions of dollars that's exciting, but I also think the approach that this policy is taking, the fact that it was integrated into the infrastructure package, that approach to scaling direct air capture and carbon removal is, I think, really smart. It's really prioritizing infrastructure in a way that we haven't done with a lot of technologies. Kirsty talked about the need to build transmission, how difficult things like that are. We've seen this with point source carbon capture in the US, to focus on just reducing costs and not thinking about, we're talking about really massive investments in infrastructure, and that is often the very tricky part. And if you can solve that piece, or if the federal government can step in early days and think about, what is it, right now you can't get a permit to store CO2 in the US, basically. It takes a very long time, and not many have been issued. And, you don't have CO2 pipelines. And there are a lot of provisions in this bill that I think take a very smart approach to scaling up these technologies. And I'll add, you asked about, sort of what to be excited about. And I think there's a lot in this, but I think, again, stepping back and thinking about not just where climate was, but where carbon removal was a few years ago and where we are today is really exciting. So I'll say we started at Carbon 180. We started our DC office almost exactly 3 years ago. And at that point, there was basically no federal funding for carbon removal. I think $11.5 million for direct air capture ever cumulatively spent in the US. There were no tax incentives. There was no, carbon negative shot from the Department of Energy. There was really nothing. And we started our DC office. The first priority we had was to increase how much money the federal government was investing in carbon removal. And our first goal was $60 million, which people thought was ambitious, if not ridiculous. And we got that 60 million. And the following years, we got more and more money. And I think we've spent such a long time telling policymakers why carbon removal is important, why they should care about it. And we're at this moment today where they know why it's important. They already do care about it. And now their question is, okay, what do we do next? It wasn't convincing members that they should, invest $3.5 billion in direct air capture hubs. It was telling them, hey, here's the technical assistance on the language, and here are the specifics, and here's how to do this policy really well. And, I think really, going from something like millions of dollars and this being something that is seen as this really niche issue and something like carbon removal to billions of dollars today, members are already asking, what more can we do? We're seeing, $180 per ton of captured CO2 for direct air capture plants and a tax incentive in the, in reconciliation in the Build Back Better Act. And, I think there's, I think that carbon removal is a place where you can see there is, not just sort of hope, but this very tangible opportunity in the near term for the US to do some massive things on climate policy.
Yeah, thanks so much, Erin. Yeah, and this has really been a sea change around carbon removal, and Carbon 180 has been at the forefront of this. And even if you only believe that, again, conservative estimates, carbon 180 would only make this 1% better, it would still be a great investment to support Carbon 180. Yeah, and kind of to get to our last speaker, Lindsay Baxter-Griffith, who's the Federal Policy Director for the Clean Air Task Force. And yeah, hi, Lindsay. So Erin kind of talked about the carbon removal piece in the recent policy wins in the United States. Could you talk a bit about kind of the decarbonization technologies, kind of the getting carbon to zero, and kind of what complements the carbon removal pieces?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Johannes. And it's really exciting to be here with all of you today. And it's been a really exciting year in the US for these types of policies. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which Erin mentioned, includes a whole lot of really important things for building out these innovation pathways that so many of our speakers have talked about the importance of. So just a couple of things to highlight, in addition to the really important carbon removal pieces, there's also an investment in sort of building out regional hydrogen hubs in the US to, commercialize clean hydrogen. There's investment in advanced reactor models and cost share with industry, which would be incredible for the nuclear space. There's even some transmission funding, which, getting at, increasing the, new loan authority that DOE and our power marketing administrations here in the US need to actually deploy the amount of transmission that we're going to need here. These are all, in total, Clean Air Task Force over the past several years has been working sort of building up to this moment and beyond. I think, seeing how these policies get implemented, how that money gets spent, bringing industry to the table and communities and everyone who needs to be involved to really make these projects successful and accelerate that innovation is really important. And that'll be the next step. But, in total at Clean Air Task Force, we worked on, of the $1.5 trillion package that passed, over $30 billion worth is going into some of these innovation and technology programs that we worked on. And it's the excitement continues here in the US. The Build Back Better Act is definitely still on the table, still under negotiation after passing in the House. Now it's over in the Senate. And you've probably heard, that's the sort of flagship $55 billion climate investment that this administration, President Biden, wants to make. And I think we would say, these are two packages that need to work hand in hand. It's really exciting to have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act because of the focus on innovation and on technology development and on these sort of critical pathways that we've talked about. The other piece, though, Build Back Better, would primarily through deployment of clean energy tax credits would really accelerate the movement of these technologies into the marketplace. So they're really two important parts of the same, policy agenda. And they're pieces that we really think that you need to have both. And hopefully there'll be lessons learned both on the innovation front and also on sort of the federal government policy side and sort of designing these new credits, adding credits, expanding credits for carbon capture, adding new credits for clean hydrogen. There's a whole lot of exciting things still to come.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lindsay. And I think one thing I kind of want to stress at the end here is like we talked about the US now, but the US is, of course, the US is like something like 10% of future emissions, but it's something like 40% or so of innovation capacity. So this really matters. And the reason, I mean, especially for our global audience today, the reason that we're supporting this work is because of the global emission reductions that this can achieve, which go far beyond the emission reductions you will see in the US over the next 5 or 10 years or however those provisions last. Yes, and with this, it's kind of time for me to close. You have a chance to speak to all of the speakers, amazing speakers, in just a few minutes. I just want to say thanks a lot for everything that you do. Obviously, this would not be possible. All of the work that we talked about is kind of based on grants that were like grants that you made to the Climate Fund that we then kind of made to those amazing organizations to push the envelope, kind of driving decarbonization further and having the maximal impact on the climate that we can have. So thanks so much, and really hope you continue to support this work. And yeah, now I give it over to Emily to introduce you to the other part of the program.
Great. Thank you, Johannes. Yes, I would love to very briefly echo Johannes's appreciation and words of praise for the work that you are all doing at your respective organizations and for being here today. Thank you also to Johannes for moderation just now. So yes, we will be moving into breakout sessions for sort of the remaining portion of our event. We will have 3 separate Ask Me Anything discussions, and they'll be based on the 3 panels that we just saw. So advancing innovation, emerging frontier. Hi, everyone. I was going to say, let's wait for everyone to join, but I think we all got booted at exactly the same time. So I think I can say with confidence that we're all here. Thank you so much. We just wanted to come together at the end here to show our appreciation first and foremost for our incredible speakers and the work that they do. Thank you also to all of you for participating in this exploration of the current climate philanthropy landscape. I hope it was a fruitful discussion, and we really, really look forward to hearing your feedback. Right on cue, actually, if you look in the Zoom chat, you'll see a link to share your feedback from today's event. We really, really value this. We want to hear all of it, and we use all of the feedback to improve future events. So please do take a moment to complete that. We would really appreciate it. If you felt inspired by our amazing speakers and the impact of the Climate Fund so far that we've made in the last year, we invite you to be a part of that change by contributing to the Climate Fund now. You will find a follow-up email from today's event, which will contain instructions for how you can donate to the Climate Fund in the future. You can also reach out to me or your community manager directly to make a donation. We look forward to welcoming new fund contributors. And again, above all, thank you so much for being here today. And on that, hope everyone has a good evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you're joining us from.